Sean, great to see you. Fantastic show tonight, and
have a great show.
It's a weird feeling here in Washington. It's an odd moment for all of us who grew up and worked in the Reagan-Bush administration.
You're right.
It's just
that's where my political interest came from. Watching those 12 years defined my love of politics, for sure.
Absolutely, for all of us. Thanks so much, Sean. Great show tonight. I'm Laura Ingraham. This is the Ingraham Angle from Washington tonight, a day of tributes in the nation's capital after the passing of the 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. And in moments, my angle takes a look at how the media are shamelessly using what should be this reverent occasion, well, to hit the current occupant of the White House, President Trump. And also tonight, a jarring admission from a UN panel. Could criticizing mass migration actually become a criminal offense? A story you will need to see to believe. Plus, President Trump and Rudy Giuliani are opening new lines of attack on how Bob Mueller's team is conducting their witness interviews. With no collusion in sight, has the special counsel actually crossed the Rubicon here? We're going to examine that. But first, honoring Bush by bashing Trump. That's the focus of tonight's angle. When a former president passes away, it's appropriate to celebrate his life, his achievements, and to remind the public of his record and his legacy. Sadly, though, with the death of George H.W. Bush, some in the media and politicians from both parties are abusing this moment to trash instead the sitting president. Now, as the Bush motorcade was making its way to the Capitol for the last time, MSNBC's Nicole Wallace, a former Bush aide herself, could not restrain herself.
I think what everyone's getting at is that under Donald Trump, the office of the presidency has been debased in a way that is unimaginable for people who served every past president. I think what's lost in this moment is our reverence and our dependence and the way we need and rely upon the elegance and the traditions of the presidency.
Let's get this straight. She's talking about reverence, and she's trashing the current president as the motorcade is inching its way up Capitol Hill. And then there was this gem from earlier in the day.
Let's see what happens at Wednesday's memorial service. My prediction is that Trump fakes more respect for families whose unprecedented history of public service has repeatedly belittled. Then he goes back to making a mockery of the very office George Bush and this nation long revered.
Well, think about it this way. President Bush was a man who loved his country, loved his family, his faith, and his friends. He was a war hero and a dedicated public servant throughout most of his life. So are these folks really honoring that legacy and his innate sense of decency and kindness by slashing the man who entered the White House 25 years after him? Look, even if you don't care for President Trump, even if you just hate President Trump, try showing just a little bit of class and decorum, as Bush 41 would have. The hits on Trump, subtle and not subtle at all, have been interwoven throughout the commentary and the coverage.
They both believe that the presidency is bigger than themselves, which is not something that this president always adheres to.
What George Herbert Walker Bush is being remembered for this week isn't a tweet or isn't a press release or nothing much more than his fundamental character.
I do not know how it's going to work when Donald Trump is an ex-president and theoretically a member of this club. I really think it's going to change because I don't think these men who share something in common really share that in common with Donald Trump.
At some point, you don't even know what to say to these people. That was Ron Klain, by the way. They lack all sense of decency. They reduce a presidential death to just a political battering ram, like any other issue. But what you hear, if you listen closely, is the last gasp of an embittered establishment. Now, as we've seen across Europe and across much of the United States, populism is swamping the old guard, whether it's on the right or on the left. So rather than direct their anger at Trump, the establishment, frankly, in both parties, should be directing it at themselves. For it is their policies that the voters turned against in 2016. Things like open borders, China trade, NAFTA, high taxes, endless wars. Those weren't Trump policies. Those were the policies of the establishment. And the establishment GOPers apparently think that the way to win back the people that they lost to Trump is to belittle the president nonstop, even during formal and informal on-air eulogies and tributes. At a time like this, when a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, and a former president has died, we should be bigger than the petty politics of the moment. I think we should be capable of uniting as Americans in celebrating the best of George H.W. Bush without resorting to the same old usual political snark and calumny. And isn't that what President Bush would have wanted? And that's the angle. Joining me now, we have an amazing panel. Former governor of Arkansas and Fox News contributor Mike Huckabee, presidential historian, Reagan biographer Craig Shirley, and former White House counsel to George H.W. Bush, Ambassador C. Boyden Gray. All of you, it is great to have you. I know former President Bush would have loved the fact that we're all getting together to talk about this moment and his legacy and honor him for who he was, his patriotism, his love of country, his deep sense of public service. Craig, I want to start with you. Wouldn't Bush, I mean, you knew him, I knew him not as well as Boyden. I want to hear from Boyden on this, but we grew up in the Reagan Revolution. Sure. I worked for President Reagan, Reagan Bush. I mean, we worked there. If it weren't for Reagan Bush, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be doing this.
Neither would I.
None of us would be here doing this.
It'd be a different world.
Yeah, so a different world. But I have to believe that the man he was wouldn't have loved a lot of the stuff he's hearing.
You know, what's amazing is that you know, when Eisenhower was in office, they derided Eisenhower as they couldn't read if his lips were chapped. Then he becomes a battering ram to be used by the establishment against conservatives. Richard Nixon was cited the other day, I saw on MSNBC, as an exemplary president. I remember how they treated Richard Nixon in office. Gerald Ford was mocked when he was in the White House, and then they made him an exemplary figure. They like presidents Republican presidents who no longer have power. They bashed the heck out of George Bush when he was in office, annoyed the bumper sticker in 92, annoyed the media, vote for Bush.
We're going to get to that in a second.
Yeah. In 88, he had famous dust-ups with the media. He banned Newsweek from his campaign plane because they produced that awful cover.
You never know this. We're going to get to the media angle on this, but now I have to say, Boyden, as the White House counsel, you knew the Bushes so well. When I first met you, I mean, it was just at the end of the Bush era in 1992. It was a heartbreaking loss. But, listening to Bill Kristol, for instance, today, he tried to capture what he thought were the big conflicts of the moment. Again, at a time where it's just great to honor who Bush was. Let's watch.
There were Reagan Republicans and Bush Republicans, George W. Bush Republicans and McCain Republicans. But what strikes me compared to today is what they all have in common, and that the Reagan Republicans and the Bush Republicans and the McCain Republicans, some were a little more conservative than others, they had different views on some issues, but they all respected the country, respected the institutions, tried to live up to what they thought was a pretty impressive history and a pretty impressive future for this country. And that is, unfortunately, I believe, a contrast with the Donald Trump's Republican Party.
I kind of agreed with everything up until the very last
end,
minute. Boyden, your sense about just how rank the abuse of this moment is, just to, again, as Craig said, bash Trump.
It doesn't make any sense, and he wouldn't have done this. That is, 41 wouldn't have. And two of Trump's greatest achievements, deregulation and judges, were right out of the Bush playbook. So I don't understand why Kristol would turn what was actually a pretty good recital into a negative in the last two sentences.
Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense.
Governor Huckabee, like all of us sitting here who owe so much to the Reagan-Bush legacy, to see, the family gathered, this is a moment of mourning, and it's a moment of reflection on a life well lived. Policy debates, they're important. Craig writes about them. I speak about them. But at this moment, it's about this incredible man. I mean, what an amazing family this was. I mean, they were well-to-do, but they never lost that kind of innate sense of love of country and love of family and their faith, which is being underplayed by some today, conveniently.
If I'm going to get a lesson in how to deal with a death and how to do it with class and dignity. I'm not going to look to Mika Brzezinski. I'm not going to look to Nicole Wallace or Bill Kristol. I'm going to look to President George H.W. Bush, who, even though he was not real fond of the 45th president and thought that some of his ways were not his, but he intentionally made sure that this president would be invited to be a part of the funeral service. Laura, that's class. That's dignity. That's the President Bush that we loved and considered to be a great statesman, who loved his country more than he disliked anybody. And I think he gave us the template for how to handle these kind of moments. And we ought to be taking our lessons from the man that we're honoring, whose casket lies in state at the Capitol right now.
Yeah, I always get such a lump in my throat when you see the casket being walked up the steps, and it's sad that these are the types of moments that are required to get us to stop for a moment, or should stop for a moment. Like, we're Americans. We want to be successful and free and independent. We have incredible history, incredible founding documents, but it shouldn't be just these moments. And I want to talk to all of you for a moment about the recasting of the historical narrative. Craig, we talked about this a little bit on the radio this morning. Right. Some of the more absurd moments of the past 24 hours came when the rabidly anti-Trump press again tried to piggyback on the death of an American patriot to defend their own reputations.
He understood that the press wasn't the enemy of the people, and even said, basically, at the end of the day, we're all in this together, and I will be here for you just like I know you would be here for me. What a remarkable difference between 1988 and 2018.
I think was a mark of that sense of respect, as I say, that was very, very noticeable then and is virtually absent.
Well, Frank,
now.
you know, he had good relations with the media. He called us the media. He invited us to White House dinners occasionally. He kept up with this. I was just reading Maureen Dowd. I love Maureen Dowd.
All right. This rank revisionism is stunning, and they regularly spewed bile against George H.W. Bush. Boyden, you worked in the White House. I was here as a young Reagan staffer. They were trashing him. And Maureen Dowd, by the way, who's lionizing him today, I mean, and she's a very, I love her writing. I've got to say, it's really fun. She used to call her, like, just belittle the Bushes, like what they watched, what they listened to for music. I was reading a column from May 1st, 1990. But she called him the gracious cruise director of international politics. She lampooned him for patting Barbara on the derriere during the Dukakis campaign. That's just the nice stuff she said about him. As for his great relationship with the press, as we alluded to earlier, look at this 1987 Newsweek cover. Bush considered it the cheapest shot of his political career. Check it out. Well, you could read it. It's like referring to him as the wimp factor. Or how about this great relationship with Dan Rather during a 1988 interview?
Well, Dan, let's be careful here because you're
Yes, sir, I want you to be careful, Mr. Vice President. Then how do you explain that you can't remember it and the other people at the meeting say he was apoplectic?
I wasn't there at that point.
You weren't in the meeting?
I'm not suggesting. I'm just saying I don't remember it.
I don't want to be argumentative, Mr. Vice President.
You do, Dan. No, this is not a great night. I don't think it's fair to judge a whole career. It's not fair to judge my whole career by a rehash on Iran. How would you like it if I judged your career by those 7 minutes when you walked off the set in New York? Well, now, would you like that?
Mr.
I have
Vice President,
respect for you, but I don't have respect for what you're doing here tonight.
Give us all a break. We could go on and on with this, but Craig, Helen Thomas, all of these crowds. Boy, you had to deal with these people.
Mary McGrory with the Washington Post once wrote that George Bush reminded every woman of her first husband. I mean, the media was vicious to him in the 80 campaign. He got in a very contentious argument with a group of reporters because they charged he wasn't tough enough to be president. This man was a war hero. He set out in the wilds of Texas to create a business. Of course he was tough enough. And he got really angry with them. He says, you know, none of you ever had to watch a child die. I did. This idea that he wasn't tough enough to be president was just nonsense. But the media, the wimp factor, which was written by Evan Thomas, who was the original red diaper baby, because his parents are both well-known rich limousine liberals, is that they viciously attacked him all during his presidential career.
I'm going to tweet this column after the show, or maybe during the commercial break. Bush's taste down home to less so. Ridiculing the Bushes' morning. I'm just reading this one piece because it captures everything that the elites think, and they were the elite. I mean, Bushes were the elites. So this was the media elites trashing Bush because he was a Republican, Boyden.
Well, I knew that he was going to win the election with that Dan Rather thing. I happened to be in the White House and stayed, couldn't leave for 3 hours because of the phone response. They loved it. And to think that he was a wimp or something like that when he took on Dan Rather, that was one of the high points of his campaign, and I think won the election.
But Boyden, you were there, Craig was there, I was there. This was nonstop combat. People have this, looking back, oh, Reagan was an avuncular man. Reagan was so nice and optimistic. Trump is so mean. Bush was tough when he needed to be. They're different personalities, different world experiences. So what? It's okay.
The author, Evan Thomas, the Newsweek was banned from the campaign.
Banned from Air Force One. Mike Huckabee. Jamie Gangale, who interviewed the Bushes many times. Remember, everyone has to remember, Bush did not vote for Donald Trump. Called him a blowhard, according to, says I didn't like Trump, but I know he's a blowhard, et cetera. So Bush didn't like Trump. That's fine. I mean, I disagree with him, but it's fine. Jamie Gangale spoke today on CNN about whether the Bush funeral and the memory of George H.W. Bush will necessarily alter the way Donald Trump speaks, like that he should have different policies, I guess, because George H.W. Bush has passed away. And I want to play this exchange for you, Governor, and have you react on the other side. Let's watch.
Will it have an effect on the tenor of this town?
It's a great point and a great question, because we had this conversation just 3 months ago when we said farewell to Senator McCain, and everybody thought maybe that would be a reset moment in Washington, and of course it was not.
The Bush family has said he has, the White House, and I think John Kelly has been responsible for this, that they have really just opened the doors, bent over backwards to make everything work.
But come next week, do we see a more bipartisan Washington when they get back to the border wall fight, when we're back to the new developments in the special counsel? I would not bet on it.
Okay, so Governor, Trump should give up the wall because George H.W. Bush died. That's the argument they're actually making on CNN.
Sophistry.
I know. Every president has his own personality. They have their own focus. And, the media, in what you've just played, has reminded us why most of Americans absolutely don't trust them and hold them in contempt. And every president has their contentious relationship with the press. This one that we have now is probably, maybe has the most contentious relationship, but it's in large measure because the press absolutely refuses to be journalists, and they just want to be opinion mongers. And it's unfortunate that taking what ought to be the celebration of a great patriot, a great statesman, a great selfless servant of this nation, and instead of focusing upon his qualities, they're trying to focus on what they perceive to be as the lack of qualities in Donald Trump, the very qualities that many Americans, frankly, believe to be the reason he's president right now.
7%, Craig, of the media, 7% voted for George H.W. Bush in 1982. Boyden's listening and goes, wait a second, was it that many? 7%?
Yeah, right.
No, but anyone.
Like no one in the
They didn't act like it, did they?
So again,
I guess they had a lot of writers at National Review that year.
Oh, exactly. But they embrace a Republican in death, but don't treat them fairly in life. Yeah, when they're actually in office, appointing people like Justice Clarence Thomas. Remember what they trashed him for the Clarence Thomas, for whom I
remember the hearings
and love.
Remember the Thomas hearings?
Oh yeah, well again.
Yeah, right.
So, but that is the world as it is. So we're not trying to gloss over the real differences that exist. But Craig, Reagan and Bush, you've written about it, Rendezvous with Destiny, which is one of the great biographies of Reagan. Tell us a little bit about that.
It was very contentious. They didn't get along. That during the 80 primaries, Boyden was there. It was heated. It was argumentative. They were from two cultural different universes. Is that one was more moderate, the other was more conservative. It was a marriage of convenience at the Detroit Convention. The Reagans so opposed picking George Bush, who most people thought was the obvious choice because Bush had come in second in the primaries, had foreign policy experience, all that. Is that they sought the co-presidency with Gerald Ford and then tried to get Paul Laxalt, former senator from Nevada, on the ticket. So they very much resisted the idea of picking George Bush.
But they ended up having 8 years in the White House and Boyden. It was a great partnership.
Very good.
So it ended up being a really good a pick in the end.
But that's politics.
That's politics.
Sure.
It's a trade-off, right, Boyd?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great choice. And Reagan really appreciated Bush, who never wanted to take credit for the great things he did for Reagan.
In a way,
Reagan knew.
In a way, a perfect vice president.
Yeah,
he was.
In that regard.
Yes.
Governor Huckabee, final thought.
Well, I think it's a great time for us to reflect upon what service sacrifice is all about. George Bush was a courageous man who enlisted, served his country underage, shot down. He lived his life, an exemplary life of family, faith, and love of country. God bless him, and God bless his memory.
And we should pray tonight for his family and all those who are grieving and mourning, and for our country. Learn something going forward about, you can disagree, but at these moments, it's time to be Americans and stand for all the goodness in his life. Great panel. Thank you so much. And President Trump and his attorney, Rudy Giuliani, ramping up their attacks on the special counsel. Is their anger warranted at this juncture? An examination in depth next.
Well, I think the special prosecutor has stepped over the line now with the way he's intimidating people in order to tell what he believes is his version of the truth. An ethical prosecutor would stop this and pursue some other line of inquiry with other people. You can only exert a certain amount of pressure before it becomes unethical and destructive.
The president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is taking aim at what he calls the destructive tactics employed by special counsel Bob Mueller's team. Now, this was soon followed by the president taking issue with a possible plea deal between his old lawyer, Michael Cohen, and Mueller's team, a deal that could spare Trump's former attorney jail time. You mean he can do all of the terrible, unrelated to Trump things having to do with fraud, big loans, taxes, etc., and not serve a long prison term? He lied for this outcome and should, in my opinion, serve a full and complete sentence. Throw away the key. Joining me now is John Sale, former Watergate prosecutor Matt Schlapp, chairman of the American Conservative Union in Byron, New York, chief political correspondent at the Washington Examiner and a Fox News contributor. All right, John, let me start with you. Is there a method to this madness now being employed by the president and Giuliani? They're kind of tag teaming on Mueller. What's the theory, strategy, point of that?
Well, I don't think it's madness. I think what they need is to maintain support in the Senate and, most importantly, with the American people. But as a defense lawyer, Michael Cohen is a dream, but I'm troubled by the power of prosecutors. Michael Cohen, the first thing that comes to your mind, what is he? He's a fixer. Well, I don't know what a fixer is. Nobody has on their LinkedIn card, I'm a fixer. I mean, I know dentists, I know doctors. I don't think I've ever met a fixer. So Michael Cohen taped his own client. What lawyer has taped his own client? A judge found probable cause to authorize searches of Michael Cohen's residence, his hotel, his office. They found a treasure trove of information which led to his plea in the Southern District of New York to tax evasion, to false statements to a bank, which involves lying. Then his lawyer goes on CNN and offers up his testimony to the special counsel. Well, is that a way to try and sell you cooperation? And then after that, what's his plea? His plea, what is it of all things? It's to lying. So if that's the best they can do, there is something wrong with, I think, the power of prosecutors. There is incentive to shade the truth.
I'm saying it as an old defense attorney. It's way out of control. They got no real supervision. They can have a budget they can blow their budget and just get more money. Byron, New York, I want to go to you. Michael Isikoff, Yahoo News, said tonight, the special counsel Bob Mueller's prosecutors have told defense lawyers in recent weeks that they're tying up loose ends in their investigation, providing the clearest clues yet that the long-running probe into Russia's interference in the campaign may be coming to its climax potentially in the next few weeks, right before Christmas.
Yes, I mean, now that has been a question recently. When we heard about Mueller talking to this whole Jerome Corsi stuff and Roger Stone stuff, and then wrapping up Michael Cohen, what's going on? Was he either opening up new inquiries in which we would have this investigation, through 2020 or something, or was he really trying to tie things up in a bow and finish it up? So a lot of these complaints that we're hearing from the president and Giuliani about Mueller could be coming at a time when Mueller's actually winding down.
Matt Schlapp, now they're actually floating the idea that Trump talking about his constitutional right to pardon could be tantamount to witness tampering, just for fun on a Monday night. Let's watch.
In the middle of an active investigation, President Trump praises Roger Stone for not testifying against him. Is this witness tampering?
That is what some lawyers would suggest. Cite 18 U.S.C. 1512. That are laws against witness tampering.
He is right on the edge of witness tampering. Federal law makes it a crime to do anything to dissuade or try to postpone or delay someone's testimony.
Can I just try to explain something here, which is everybody involved in this investigation, if you're Mike Flynn, if you're Paul Manafort, any of these names you just mentioned, they all know that there's a chance of a presidential pardon. And they all know the president has already used his pardon powers, you know, I wouldn't say aggressively, but robustly. So they all know this is at play. So why is Michael Cohen doing what he's doing? He's a no-down dirty dog. They have everything on him they could possibly want.
He wants it. Well, he was looking at, you know, basically life in prison. Now it's down to about 60 months.
Because he has a corrupt
he wants
business.
that wiped out altogether.
But it's just corrupt business. Let's remember, it's corrupt business. That's what they got on.
Taxi shields.
When Papadopoulos pleaded to lying,
Yeah.
and Van der Swan pleaded to lying, and Flynn pleaded to lying, people said, well, I guess they're not going to use them as witnesses because they've just pleaded to lying. Well, this has just happened to Michael Cohen. So he's not, Mueller is not planning to
They're
use
not nothing
these
but they're
men
processed
as witnesses in a future prosecution.
But John, we don't know what Mueller has. I mean, I keep saying this as an attorney, and you don't know what the Mueller team has. Andrew Weissman doesn't. He's not over there in the Southwest Washington at the Mueller headquarters with the little marble faux pillars out front, where he's playing patty cake. So. There's something that we're not seeing that they're holding back. I'm not saying it's, the big kahuna here, but there's something else that's going on, because otherwise the week that they wrote this editorial today, they said the following: the special counsel has taken his attention away from diplomacy and other ordinary business of the presidency. Mueller has failed to deliver the goods, not simply because there are no goods to deliver, but because delivering them is not the point. The point is to hurt Trump. Like, they haven't gotten close to collusion. Even old Jake Tapper said that last week.
Well, regardless of what Mueller has, nobody is pointing out that there's a presumption of innocence, which goes to everybody, including the president. So I just am at a loss for everybody saying, my God, Mueller must have something and the whole world's going to cave in. Whatever Mueller has.
There's some tricks up their sleeves. I don't think this is just going to be some tepid report that says, well, they could have just used some better judgment, Byron York, where it's like the appearance of impropriety.
Can I point out one thing very quick?
Yeah,
real
quick. Then we gotta
the problem with a special counsel is they're on a mission.
Everything.
If they do a thorough investigation, they have not failed if their conclusion is the president did not break the law. They are just as successful in their mission if they come to that conclusion.
Good for you.
Bingo.
It's going to be a one-sided report because that's what he's doing. He's a prosecutor. He's not going to give a defense brief for the president. So he's going to give it to Congress. It's going to get to Congress. And the new Democratic majority will figure whether...
Can I say something real fast on that? It's very important. This is a political exercise. Impeachment, special counsels, it's all about politics, Laura. We just had a big nationwide campaign. Show me the ads the Democrats ran on collusion. It's not a real thing. This whole investigation, as far as the American people are concerned, as far as their daily lives, has no impact, and they're tired of it.
No, but later on we'll tell you what does have impact is what's going on in the trade world and with China. We're going to get into that, and also a shocking proposal, great segment, guys, from a United Nations official. Could the mere criticism of mass migration end up now becoming a criminal offense? This is not exaggeration. We're going to play the tape, a story that has my blood boiling, and it had it boiling over the weekend. Next. Frightening proposals emerging from a UN panel over the weekend. Not only does the so-called United Nations Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration want to make immigration a universal human right, they want to make it a crime for media outlets to allow for certain types of criticism against migration. Watch.
Criticism of migration will become a criminal offense. And media outlets, and that also concerns you, that give room to criticism of migration can be shut down.
Here now is someone who knows more about this than the average Joe, I would say. This diminished EU today is Nigel Farage. He was the vice chairman of the pro-Brexit movement that raised red flags about all these issues, especially on immigration destroying the fibre of the UK. Nigel, thanks for staying up so late for us tonight. We really appreciate it. Is there a chance that with this global compact on migration that this actually could come to pass, that this type of criticism of migration could be criminalized?
Well, you were quite right to say that what the UN wants to do is to make migration a human right. What it also wants to do is to make illegal immigration legal by defining a refugee as anybody that wants to move between countries. So basically what it wants to do is to make us all global citizens, and governments are going to this next week. Many will sign up to it without ever consulting their own people. But you're quite right. The most worrying part is the section on the media, where it says very clearly that media outlets who are intolerant, critical, xenophobic or racist in their criticism of mass migration. Now, as soon as you start to define people like that, you're getting into territory where people can be defined as committing hate crimes. They want to make it, they actually want to make it illegal to criticize open-door immigration. Is it actually going to work? Well, thankfully, the UN itself doesn't have legal power. But
Nigel, doesn't this also, though, operate as kind of a framework for international human rights cases? And it ends up being a framework that, under a different Supreme Court in this country, could actually be referenced. I mean, there are a lot of justices who believe that referencing foreign law is okay, which, of course, it's not the way it's done in our country, and sadly it's been done in the past. But so that's the problem, is it becomes another international norm. And climate change, obviously, is one thing. I'm not talking about climate change, but in this case, it's a norm. So we do a lot of stuff on migration. You and I have talked about the immigration, illegal immigration issue for years. So just talking about the fact that we have so many illegal immigrants on social welfare now in the United States, a big survey just came out today, about 61% on some type of social program. That would be considered perhaps hateful.
Yeah, I mean, here I am in London. There are, as we speak, 1,000 police officers in London who just investigate hate crime. And the definitions of what is hate crime get broader and broader. This is an attempt by the UN to make any criticism of mass migration something that should be considered criminal. And effectively, what they're saying is they will favour media outlets that promote their ideas materially. I mean, they're even talking about funding media outlets that support their view. No, I'm being serious, and believe me, I've seen this myself in Brussels, because the European Union, that is the sort of prototype for the globalists, and the European Commission actually give money to media organisations that promote their views and increasingly demonise those that take a different point of view. And you're right, the International Criminal Court, areas like that can start to make judgments in these areas that will, be referenced by national courts.
And they also, they marginalize voices. You see this happening on social media. It's happened on Twitter, obviously on Facebook, YouTube channels. They're making judgment calls on who is and who is not part of the acceptable club. Nigel, I want to play a soundbite from the Grande Dame of migration, which is Angela Merkel, of course. This is just from about a week and a half or so ago. Let's watch.
Der Pakt für Migration genauso wie der Pakt für Flüchtlinge ist der richtige Antwortversuch, wir stehen ja am Anfang, globale Probleme auch international und miteinander zu lösen.
Well, you're on satellite, so unless your German is really good, I'll tell you that it was basically just, this is a right. We have to stand up for the right of refugees. Well, I believe in standing up for refugees, but it doesn't mean that every country's border has to remain open if a global entity like the UN says, okay, you got to do it, whether it's to the 7,000 people in Tijuana or to any other group.
Well, let's just remember what a refugee is. There is a 1951 definition of what a refugee is, and it's a person in fear of their life or their liberty as a result of their race, their religion, their views, their orientation. That does not mean that millions of people that have crossed the Mediterranean over the last couple of years, encouraged by Angela Merkel, were refugees. They weren't. They were economic migrants coming from all over the world, using the opportunity of the huge stupidity made by Angela Merkel. I genuinely believe, for example, Laura, that Christians living in Iraq and countries like that, who've literally got nowhere to go, they qualify as genuine refugees, but you cannot open the door to mass millions and suddenly pretend that's okay. And this is exactly what the UN are trying to do next week. They're trying to bail out Angela Merkel and the other politicians who've made these huge mistakes. And I would have thought what Mrs. Merkel ought to do, rather than defending her judgment, is to apologise to millions of German people for fundamentally changing the nature and the culture of the towns and cities in which people live without ever asking the people.
Now, Sweden's seeing its populist movement. We saw the results of the last election. We see it happening in Andalusia, in Spain. Macron is a lot of reasons. He's in some really hot political water. Obviously, Brexit. Things are changing, and the elites don't get the message. But Nigel, thank you for being up with us late. A really important topic, and I really, really appreciate it. Thanks so much. And my friends, it's often kind of hard to understand just why China is such a threat to you, the American people, the American worker, American factories, real jobs. Our next guest is going to show you what happens when China tries to destroy an American manufacturing base. One company that's fought against China and won. He's going to tell us why this is so important. The man fighting back will explain next. Frightening proposals emerging from a UN panel over the weekend. Not only does the so-called United Nations Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration want to make immigration a universal human right, they want to make it a crime for media outlets to allow for certain types of criticism against migration. Watch.
Criticism of migration will become a criminal offense. And media outlets, and that also concerns you, that give room to criticism of migration can be shut down.
Here now is someone who knows more about this than the average Joe, I would say. This diminished EU today is Nigel Farage. He was the vice chairman of the pro-Brexit movement that raised red flags about all these issues, especially on immigration destroying the fibre of the UK. Nigel, thanks for staying up so late for us tonight. We really appreciate it. Is there a chance that with this global compact on migration, that this actually could come to pass, that this type of criticism of migration could be criminalized?
Well, you were quite right to say that what the UN wants to do is to make migration a human right. What it also wants to do is to make illegal immigration legal by defining a refugee as anybody that wants to move between countries. So basically what it wants to do is to make us all global citizens, and governments are going to this next week. Many will sign up to it without ever consulting their own people. But you're quite right. The most worrying part is the section on the media, where it says very clearly that media outlets who are intolerant, critical, xenophobic or racist in their criticism of mass migration. Now, as soon as you start to define people like that, you're getting into territory where people can be defined as committing hate crimes. They want to make it, they actually want to make it illegal to criticize open-door immigration. Is it actually going to work? Well, thankfully, the UN itself doesn't have legal power. But
Nigel, doesn't this also, though, operate as kind of a framework for international human rights cases? And it ends up being a framework that, under a different Supreme Court in this country, could actually be referenced. I mean, there are a lot of justices who believe that referencing foreign law is okay, which, of course, it's not the way it's done in our country, and sadly it's been done in the past. But so that's the problem, is it becomes another international norm. In climate change, obviously,
yes,
is one thing. I'm not talking about climate change, but in this case, it's a norm. So we do a lot of stuff on migration. You and I have talked about the migration, immigration, illegal immigration issue for years. So just talking about the fact that we have so many illegal immigrants on social welfare now in the United States, a big survey just came out today, about 61% on some type of social program. That would be considered perhaps hateful.
Yeah, I mean, here I am in London. There are, as we speak, 1,000 police officers in London who just investigate hate crime. And the definitions of what is hate crime get broader and broader. This is an attempt by the UN to make any criticism of mass migration something that should be considered criminal. And effectively, what they're saying is they will favour media outlets that promote their ideas materially. I mean, they're even talking about funding media outlets that support their view. No, I'm being serious, and believe me, I've seen this myself in Brussels, because the European Union, that is